Exploring the Wonders of Fall Migration, Insights from Cape May and Cape Florida Banding Stations. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anna Lima, and I'm with Tropical Audubon Society. We're going to go over a quick housekeeping, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers and get on with the program. Tonight, all attendees are in listen mode only. If you have a question, you can use the chat function on the bottom, usually on the bottom of your screen, and put your questions in the chat while the Zoom is ongoing. And we will have our moderator, Tropical Audubon Society Field Trip Coordinator Brian Raposa, moderate the questions after the presentation is over. And a recording of the presentation will be made available online on the Tropical Audubon website in the upcoming days, and we will be sending out an email to everyone who registered with a copy of the recording in the upcoming days. Next slide, please. So let me introduce our speakers for this evening. We have Michelle Davis, a field ornithologist for 30 years. Michelle settled in South Florida in 2000 while contributing to studies of the endangered Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow in the Everglades National Park. Michelle also co-founded the Cape Florida Banding Station on Key Biscayne in 2002. Michelle is currently a bander in charge for the Cape May Songbird Stopover project in southern New Jersey, while remaining in a consultant role for the Cape Florida Banding Station. We also have Steffanie Munguía. Steffanie is on the board of the National Audubon Society and a lifelong conservationist. She began her undergraduate studies as an avian ecologist. As a doctoral candidate at FIU, she now studies how policies and communities interact to manage critical stopover sites for migratory birds in the Caribbean. She works full-time for Citizens Climate, supporting college students to get involved in the climate movement. Since the fall of 2020, she has been spending her free time at the Cape Florida Banding Station as an extractor and bander. I've had the pleasure of knowing these two brilliant ladies for a few years now, getting to work with them. And one thing their bios don't say is that both of them are always willing and ready to donate their time and talents to share their passion and knowledge about birds and South Florida ecosystems and migration with the community at large, and Tropical Audubon Society is very grateful for that. So with that, let's get on with the program and enjoy. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And when the presentation is over, Brian Raposa will be the moderator, and we will pose the questions to the presenters. Thank you very much. All right, Michelle and Steffanie.
Oops, sorry, my turn. Hold on. Here we go. Oh, shoot. Steffanie, can you make it big again?
Oh,
I'm it shrunk on my screen. Is it still big on yours?
It's still big on my screen.
It's looking good, Michelle. You can push on.
It looks okay. Okay, it's just mine. So I'm going to explain first a little bit about migration ecology. Why do these birds do this long, dangerous trip? Well, it's these songbirds, millions of them. Okay, it's just slow. To scroll. Millions upon millions of songbirds fill the air in spring and fall. They usually migrate at night, and they oh, sorry, I'm just Steffanie, will you scroll for me? I'm finding it distracting how long it takes. Yeah, just there. Fine, thanks. So millions of birds have evolved to migrate. They think it evolved because in the tropics are full of birds, and during the spring and summer, the temperate climates open up with all this habitat that is basically has very few birds in it that can survive the winter. So the system evolved for these birds to go from the tropics and spread out across the temperate zones all summer, breed, and then turn around and fly back. And the systems work for millions of years, even though it does seem kind of dangerous for individual birds, but they do it year after year after year, and they've evolved a bunch of different ways of trying. Stephanie, cute. Come on. Okay. They've evolved a bunch of different ways to deal with this flight and make it work. One thing, the picture on the right, birds do tend to fly. Oh, I need to go back. I'm sorry. Birds do tend to fly, and they call them flyways. They're not, I mean, it is, they have the whole sky. It's not just like roads or something, but birds really do stick to certain routes if they're trying to go to certain places because of, you know, evolution. So we get the blue route, the Atlantic Flyway is where most of the birds in South Florida, and actually a lot of the birds in New Jersey are going. This gets birds from eastern Canada, northeastern US, going down the Atlantic seaboard, and most of them are wintering either in the islands, the Greater Antilles. Some are going all the way to South America, and a few are going to Central America. You can actually watch migration on the weather radar, which is the picture on the left. That's a big migration day in September of 2020. All those green blobs are different weather radars, and the green is birds flying through the radar station. And so we actually can watch them. They migrate at night, and you can actually watch them take off. You see light blue become darker green, and then Phil, you can actually watch a blob of birds that's shaped like South Florida leave like about when it's fully dark. Let's see. There we go. So these birds migrate at night. Most of the songbirds do. Hawks and swallows and stuff migrate during the day. Songbirds migrate at night. They think they migrate at night because the air is more stable, it's cooler, and there's not hawks and other predators around. And also it gives them all day long to forage if they need to forage. And how do these birds find their way at night? These tiny little birds, they have lots of cues. This is part of the wonder of migration that they actually can read the stars and the sun. They understand, they have in their head, kind of like old seafarers had, where they could read the sky and the pattern of the stars to know where they were going. Birds have that in their head. They also know where magnetic north is. They can read landmarks, like they know where the ocean is, they know where mountains are, and they remember where they're going if they're on a return trip. They also orient themselves against the wind direction, so they understand when the wind suddenly blows out of the north, that if it's fall, that's their tailwind that they need. And so you'll get extra birds, more birds than usual, like rising up and flying south after a cold front, because it means it's usually clear air and a perfect tailwind. Let's see. And the physiology for how they do this is pretty amazing. The birds put on a giant fat load, sometimes like almost half again their weight. And organs, like their reproductive organs, all shrink down to hardly anything. And their respiratory system and circulatory system is incredibly efficient. They've seen geese flying over like up around Mount Everest, where people have to have oxygen masks and stuff, and these birds are flying, flapping. It's pretty strenuous. And these even small birds, songbirds, can fly like 24, 36 hours nonstop, but they have to. This picture on the right, where that is a live bird. You're looking through the skin of a living bird. Their skin is translucent. So I took a little bit of water and spread the feathers apart. And what you're looking at is that line down the middle is the breastbone. The red on either side is a muscle, and the yellow at the top and the bottom is the fat. So the fat fills every kind of hollow that is in the bird's body. And so they stay streamlined, and it's just amazing that they can be so much heavier and yet they can still fly. And birds though require, they get fat loads like that when they're about to cross the ocean. But birds do require stopover sites. It's basically like if you're going up the turnpike, you need to be able to stop at the plazas to refuel your car or get a bite to eat. There's kind of 3 levels of stopover sites. The very first basic level is a fire escape, which is basically there's a storm, I need to land. This is a picture of a spring fallout, a lighthouse in Maine. It was covered with birds. I saw a video last week of a lobster fisherman out in the ocean after Hurricane Lee, and his boat was covered with migrating, just exhausted warblers. And then he was like trying to scoop some up, plume an occasion, take them back to shore. And the other two, the next levels for stopovers is a convenience store, which is like a small patch of habitat where a bird not just can land, but can also get cover, shelter, and eat a little bit. But it's a kind of a small spot. And the third level is the full service hotel where a bird could actually stay for a long time and, in fact, could spend the winter. So Cape Florida can be a fire escape to anything in a storm. It's a convenience store, and also a particular stopover site can be different things for different species. Like Cape Florida is like a fire escape for things like Blackburnians, which would rather be inland in more extensive forests. When they show up in Miami, they're usually inland in like 80 barns or somewhere. It's a convenience store for black-throated blues, which will be out there and they'll hang out and they like it, but then they move through. And it's a full-service hotel for ovenbirds. They'll spend the whole winter there. We had one guy for 9 years that came back for 9 winters.
Great. Wonderful. So thank you, Michelle. And now that you all know a little bit of the why and how of bird migration, we're going to talk a little bit about why we're handling migrating songbirds at what is probably one of the most physiologically challenging times in their lives. What is the scientific reason for doing this? So before going too deep into it, I really want to emphasize and underscore that this is scientific research. Everything that you're going to see in our photographs is done with the proper permitting and training. We have federal, state, and park permits that certify that we know how to safely handle these birds and that we have good reason to do so, because this is, as you've already learned, migration is a really challenging and physically stressful time for birds. So we want to make sure that we have good reason for collecting these data. Our volunteers are also trained in safe handling techniques. So if you ever are able to come out on a tropical Audubon walk to the station, what you'll never see is somebody who's never handled a bird before with a bird in their hands. We spend a lot of time making sure that people know how to handle them safely so that birds don't get injured. And a couple of the ways that we do this is by using appropriate holds, because the bird safety is our #1 priority. What you see here are 2 of the most common and safest holds we can use on this size bird. We've got our bander's grip with the trails flycatcher there on the left-hand side. And even though it looks like I put this bird in a chokehold, I promise the bird is perfectly comfortable, breathing normally, and it's actually really secure. You can't flop around and potentially injure itself trying to escape. On the right is photographer's grip, which if you followed our blog in the past, you've mostly seen pictures of birds in this grip because, as the name implies, it's the best way to catch a beautiful shot like this one of this yellow-breasted chat. So how do we get them out of the sky and into our hands? It's probably the #1 question I get asked by people. Well, we do this with the help of mist nets, which are strategically placed throughout the banding habitat. And if you can't see it, don't worry, that's kind of exactly the point. So I'm going to try to help you out. So that little line is pointing at where the mist net is in the photo. If you have to lean in a little bit closer to your screen, it's okay. I've walked into these many a time, even in broad daylight. And that's sort of how it works. The birds also generally don't see them. So they'll fly into the net as they're foraging in the habitat or as they're dropping out or dropping in for the morning to rest for the day. And they might encounter a net in that process. Now, the net does not harm them. They're very gentle, delicate nets. Their feathers just get caught up in them and their feet will go through them. And then our trained extractors and banders, like Nicole in the photo on the right, will gently remove that bird from the net, making sure that we're not straining their wings or their legs or injuring them in any way. Then each bird is placed in an individual bag and taken back to the banding tent, where a bander is waiting to process them quickly and safely. And you can see there on the right a little behind the scenes shot of what it looks like to pull a bird out of a bag when you're looking in there and a gray catbird is peering up out at you as he's waiting for a brand new bling to be placed on one of his legs. And they stay pretty calm in these bags is the point of it. It helps to keep them kind of neutralize the movement and environment around them. So once the bander is processing them, we're recording a few different data points. The first one is age and sex by plumage. Now, not all birds are sexable by plumage, but we can at least tell age in all of them. And for the most part, we can actually get down to understanding whether we're looking at a male or a female. We also take measurements of size, starting with the length of the wing. We take a look at condition, like the photo that Michelle showed of that red-eyed vireo with the very, very thick fat accumulation. And we weigh them. And for a little bit of perspective, that's an American redstart there in the tube. Again, a safe way to handle them. It looks a little funny, but it keeps them from moving around too much. And that redstart weighs about 8 grams, which is not atypical. They're quite small in the hand. So that's the scale of bird that we're working with. If we're doing our job right, this entire process can be completed in a single bird in a matter of a minute or 2 at the most. So it does move quite quickly, and we're able to send them on their way. The most important step, though, is we put a band on them. And that band has a unique 9-digit code. It is an aluminum band, so it is durable, it's lightweight, and we can identify that specific individual and track it down using the Bird Banding Laboratories database to figure out where it was originally banded and when. That's what allows us to know, for example, that ovenbird spent 9 winters with us. And they're placed on the leg in a location where it's not going to interfere with most of their behaviors. There's actually been a lot of research done to determine if banding birds impacts their longevity in any way, and the science is pretty conclusive that it is a safe way to track our migratory species. And then we're able to get them on their way. They're safely released to continue their migration journeys. A lot of times they're safely released to continue fattening up if they've just had to drop out after poor weather conditions. And they'll stick around for a few days in the banding area. We might even recapture them and be able to see how they're putting on fat. So we're collecting a lot of data while they're with us. And ideally, we'll get to collect some data as they touch down in other places. And that's kind of the whole point of banding. It seems like a little bit of an old school way of collecting data when we're also looking at things like MODIS towers and trackers, but banding has been foundational to the field of ornithology. And we've learned all sorts of things about dispersal and migration patterns through these techniques, just by tracking where they were originally banded and where they end up. We can learn about their behavior and social structure, especially if we're using things like color banding to identify individuals and track them in a landscape as they interact with each other. We can determine their lifespan by seeing how old they were when they were originally banded and how many years it has been. We can estimate population just based on how many of them we've marked versus how many we end up recapturing. After an extreme event like an oil spill in the Gulf, researchers can also use banding to estimate survival and productivity of coastal seabirds, for example. And we can track toxins in the environment and disease transmission through the process of banding by collecting additional data like blood samples and tissue samples. And as you can see, they really do fly off just fine after that entire process. They probably think they've been abducted by aliens, but it takes very little time and they're ready to go back on their journeys. So we have seen a few examples of our banding stations sharing some birds. So Michelle, do you want to share a little bit about our recoveries?
Yeah, this map is basically this 2 stars. You know, the star in Florida is Cape Florida, the star in New Jersey is Cape May, and yellow dots are birds that we've banded, and then other people have sometimes other banders have recaptured them. Sometimes they're found dead, unfortunately, like they might hit a window or something. And the red dots are birds that other banders have banded and that we've recaptured. So it basically, this is in real life that Atlantic Flyway slide from the beginning, where we are there's a bird all the way up here is the furthest one, furthest recovery that we've had, all the way down in Puerto Rico, with a lot from the northeastern US, and then some of these are painted bunting records, this little cluster in South Carolina and Georgia, because that's where a lot of our painted buntings go to spend this breed. And then around Florida, we have had one from Cuba that was banded there. It was a catbird, and we caught it northbound in spring. And then this dot, the Puerto Rican dots, is interesting because on a wintering bird project, a guy was for a project was banding birds in mangrove habitat, just looking at winter bird communities, and he recaptured one of our water thrushes during that project. I think it was winter of 2015, 2016, and then he was also banding other birds. And then fast forward to 2020, we recaptured a prairie warbler that he'd banded in 2015, the same year he recaptured our bird. So we had an exchange spread out over like 4 years of we caught his bird, he caught ours, which that's amazing that that could actually happen, given how many millions of birds are out there. Another nice exchange was last year, we caught a gray catbird banded at Cape May. I think it was banded up here on about the 10th of October, and we caught it on the 22nd of October after a really nice, that nice mid-October cold front came down. So that catbird took that tailwind and got all the way down here in about 12 days, and which is pretty good. Yeah, that bird was making good time. And so our banding locations are, so migration, you can kind of think of migration on a big level and then narrowing in into the smaller regions. So on the big scale, you've got the Atlantic Flyway, and up north you have birds. So some species are going down the coast, other species are going along the Appalachian Mountains. Like in Cape May, we hardly catch, or even blackbirdians, stuff like that. Black-throated blues are a lot less of them up here. And we also are at Cape May catching almost entirely juvenile birds. It's the adults want to be inland, but we still have all the birds in the Northeast. And then as they go south, birds that want to go more to Central America are splitting off. They're going either around the Gulf, across the Gulf, maybe down west coast of Florida, and then jumping through the Keys through Western Cuba to get to Central America. Miami, like 80%, 90% of the birds we're catching are species and individuals bound for the Greater Antilles and Northern South America. And so these birds on this large scale, when they're looking for a place to stop over, they're drawn to south-facing islands and peninsulas. And also Cape Florida. You can see by this map that Cape Florida is an oasis. There's like Cape Florida, there's Crandon, there's just a few in this urban area. So there's very few places for them to go. I mean, look at that green there. It's just, so the combination of the shape of the island and that patch of green on the end makes it a very attractive spot for migrating birds to come. And Cape May has a very similar shape. It's this protuberance sticking off the bottom of New Jersey. And same thing, it's not, the part on the left of the picture on the right is where our banding station is. Cape May is obviously not nearly as developed as Miami, but you still have that same kind of geographical funneling effect of birds southbound. They get out over the ocean and they just kind of come into these islands. So this is an overview of the general area where the Cape May banding station is. And we're actually, I don't know if you guys can see my pointer, probably not, but the banding station is in the upper right-hand corner, kind of not too far from that road that's going straight up. And so the weather influences, they have the tailwinds. What happens is both Cape Morgan, Cape Florida, and Cape May get the maximum amount of birds out there when the wind's out of the northwest. So what's happening on the local level is that they're migrating at night. Birds usually want to initiate an ocean crossing right after sunset to give themselves all night over the water. So what happens when birds, the north wind's giving them the tailwind they want. The west wind is kind of blowing them out over the ocean. And we have, because of the geography, we're on a north-south oriented coast with, at the very tip of an island or a peninsula, the same kind of effect is happening in Cape May and Cape Florida, where the north wind's making the birds move, the west wind's pushing them out over the ocean, and you'll see birds at sunrise. They'll see that they're out over the water and they don't really want to be over the water yet, so they'll cut back in to the nearest land. So that's why they pile up on these islands. And in Cape May, it's mostly juvenile birds, first-year birds doing their first migration to get that pile up in what are called kind of coastal migrant traps, and where the habitat's maybe not quite as good as further inland. By the time they get to South Florida, though, we don't have that same division of adults inland and young on the coast. They're all at Cape Florida, we catch about 50% adults of a lot of species.
So another thing that we share in common, other than we both happen to be at locations that have a lighthouse, even though I don't think the lighthouse is helping the birds navigate at all, both of these sites have also experienced some really interesting restoration work. In South Cape May, even though that is not as urbanized as Miami, there was a significant impact from many, many years of grazing on those areas that destroyed the pre-existing wetlands that were there. It left that area very vulnerable to coastal storm events. And so there's been a lot of efforts through the Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps of Engineers to do some beach renourishment, do some dune restoration along the coastline, and also to rebuild the wetlands that used to exist there. And that's created this nice mosaic of habitats from coastal to inland that the birds can use in a variety of different ways. And it's part of what makes Cape May such a mecca for birders. In Bill Baggs, we similarly, I think as many folks on the call might remember, in the early 90s experienced a really catastrophic event in the form of Hurricane Andrew. Interestingly for Bill Baggs though, before Andrew, that area was actually relatively low habitat quality. It was predominantly an Australian pine monoculture, which is not a native species, does not provide a lot of foraging opportunities for migrating birds. So the sort of silver lining out of that event was that it also gave the state park system an opportunity to come in and do some meaningful restoration work and turn Bill Baggs Cape Florida into the real kind of urban paradise, if you will, that we see today, where we can see this restored forest landscape that features more of our subtropical hardwood hammock plants, a lot more of our ficus trees, which are a great food source for migrating birds, stoppers and buttonwoods and all of those kind of great plants. And just in the span of 30 years, we've seen great increases in the native vegetation in that area. And that's made this an even more high quality stopover site for our birds. So here's another, just a little bit of a closer look at our banding habitat. Again, if you're still practicing finding the mist nets, there's a mist net in both sides of the screen, so good luck. So you see we've got a mix of some of our native palm species. We also have sea grapes and really kind of traditional, stereotypical coastal hardwood hammock that you would expect to see in South Florida. And the birds really take advantage of this high quality habitat as they're passing through.
The Cape May habitat, and this has the nets are put in, there's about 4 kind of microhabitat types in the woods, in a marshy area, and then this edge habitat, which the trees are a lot lower there. It's kind of coastal scrub. This is this was a meadow, and Nature Conservancy took it over in it's been about 40 years it's been growing back. So it's got all this coastal shrubby habitat. I bet the trees won't get too much taller than that because we're very close to the ocean. And the birds really love this edge habitat. And we can, because it's not so hot, we can have nets in locations you can never get away with South Florida that are on the edge and sunnier, and we can actually run them most of the morning. And that's nice for some reasons I'll get to later.
Great. So now we get to the fun part where we get to show off and maybe brag a little bit about what we've been seeing so far this fall. So here are our top 10 birds for, we're going to start with Cape Florida first. So I do want to preface this by saying this is what we've caught so far in fall. I think Michelle and I are both going to share a little bit about why these rankings are not going to hold. But so far, our most popular bird by far is the ovenbird, and these lovely friends are here early in the season, and many of them will overwinter, so we'll continue to catch them throughout the season. But of the about a little over 600 birds, we might have broken 700 today, that we have banded so far this season, about a quarter of them have been ovenbirds, so we get to see quite a few of them. Mm-hmm. Second up are our lovely American redstarts, and in these photos, I'm trying to show the male and female for those that are sexually dimorphic, where you can tell them apart. These are coming in at a little over 100 banded so far. I pooled all of these numbers on Tuesday, and then we had a nice big day yesterday, so these numbers are a little bit out of date, but they give you a sense of where we are in the rankings. Third up, we have our worm-eating warbler, one of my personal favorites at the station. I think anybody who's been out there and worked with these guys before probably thinks they should be renamed the finger-eating warbler, but we make do and it does not hurt us at all. They just got to get it out of their system. They're a little bit spunky. In number 4, we have our black and white warbler, another fan favorite. A little over, I think now we're probably a little over 70 that have been banded. You can see here a male on the right-hand side and a female is a little buffier on the left. Now, as I mentioned, not all of them can be distinguished by sex, and a great example of that is our northern water thrush, another popular migrant through the station. We've seen quite a few of these. We do also get their very similar Louisiana water thrush cousins, but they do migrate at a slightly different point in the season, and we don't get them in nearly the high numbers that we would the northerns. At number 6, this is going to be the biggest shakeup by the time we reach the end of the season. We have our black-throated blue warbler, and of course, we can't resist showing you male and female side by side. We've got a long way to go with these guys, but they're still made it into the top 10 so far. And these are one of our station mascots. We're actually quite lucky because of our location. We get a lot of these compared to other banding sites throughout the country. So this is our official, unofficial Neener bird for everyone else at banding stations across the US. In number 7, we've got prairie warblers. Love the contrast between the blue and the yellow. We'll start seeing fewer of these as the season goes on later and later, but they are a great kind of on the smaller end size of the birds that we handle. In that same kind of size category, we've got northern parula, definitely one of the more colorful warblers that we get to handle. Number 9, we've got our common yellowthroat, and we've got a couple of two-way ties as we get to the end. So you're just going to get a couple of bonus species. I hope nobody's mad about that. But our common yellowthroats are also moving through. We get a lot of lovely pubescent males who are just growing in their masks at this time of year. That's adorable. They're trying their hardest. They will be very attractive by the time they head back to their breeding grounds in the spring, though. They're just going through some awkward puberty. We also get our blue-gray gnatcatchers. This is one of those that we see a lot at the banding station. That's one of the best parts about spending this much time out in the field is you get a sense of what's moving through, but what we catch is not always what's moving through. And gnatcatchers are a really great example. We see them consistently. They are loud. They make their presence known. But because they're aerial insectivores, they seem to have a really good sense of where the nets are. And you will often see them kind of hover right up to the net and just like stare at it and then back away and fly a different direction. So we don't get to see as many of them, but when we do, we really do enjoy getting a closer look at these guys. They're the smallest birds we typically band. And another two-way tie right now is between our Swainson's warbler. This is an early in the season migrant, so we're enjoying them while they last. And our red-eyed vireos, which we'll expect to see more of them as the season progresses too. We also get some kind of odd species. They're not odd because they're unusual in the area, but because we don't get to band nearly as many of them, so we really enjoy them. One of them is the chuck-will's widow. This is a nocturnal species of frogmouth, so they have these giant mouths that you would not guess based on the size of kind of the visible bill that you might be able to see in the photo. They're just incredibly well adapted for what they do. They have these nice long wings that allow them to soar, a long tail for gliding, big eyes for that nocturnal hunting. But still stubby little feet. So they're really quite fun to have in the hand and explore these different adaptations. This season, we've also had a high number of hooded warblers, and last fall, we only caught 3. We already are up to 5 for the season, so that's been a nice treat to see these moving through. And I think the crown jewel of this season so far, and arguably one of the best catches we've had at the station in a while, is a white crowned pigeon. And if you've been out to Bill Bags, you've probably seen them flying around. They're not an unusual bird in the park, but they are incredibly unusual in our nets because, as I mentioned, those nets are really delicate. They're kind of shaped perfectly to capture songbirds, not so much to get a pigeon, which is kind of fat and roly-poly and has a tendency to pop right out of the net if they do hit it. This young white-crowned pigeon clearly hadn't figured the game out yet and managed to get stuck in a net. So that was a nice treat for some of our banders and volunteers last week to be able to handle that bird. Now we'll look at Cape May.
So we right now, also we're also about halfway through our field season. We started the same day as Cape Florida, and our number one bird is common yellowthroat. We probably caught 60 more today. So this my totals are from yesterday, and same thing. They're just all over the place. This, it's a very abundant bird all across North America, and they're coming your way. But we're about a month ahead of Cape Florida, and our number two bird is northern water thrush. We have really, really heavy flights of northern water thrush in late August and early September. Same as with Cape Florida, the top 10 at the end of the year are going to be totally different. More about that later. But right now, northern water thrush is in second place. It was in first place until about last week. And third place is American redstart. But we caught a male today or yesterday. That picture's from yesterday. And we've caught, out of 371 redstarts that we banded, I've seen about 4 adult males. That's how much more intense the separation between hatchier and adults is on the coast up here, where we have days at Cape Florida where there's adult males all over the place. And we're up to our ears and eyes in trails flycatchers. We've had a couple of yellow-bellied, one least, one Acadian, but a lot of these trails, which are really 2 species, they're alder and willow. They're really hard to separate. We take a lot of measurements. We're probably going to look at them at the end of the season and put them into some formulas on the computer, and try to see if we can separate the willows from the least. I call it the chameleon empid because they try to look like other species. Some want to look like Acadian, some try to look like least, some try to look like yellow-bellied. But when you catch another species of empid, no, that's really yellow-bellied. The one before was a trails trying to act like a yellow-bellied. But they're cute. And we have catbirds. We still have our catbirds to come to, but we started into the catbirds, and you guys know they really show up in October for you. But we also had breeding catbirds, but we're just now starting to get, just this week, we're starting to get a decent number of migrants, but we haven't been completely slammed with them yet. I assume that's going to happen probably in the next week or so. And we have black and white warbler in our top 10, about 67. So some of these birds, for how many more birds we catch at Cape May, there are certain species at Cape Florida can hold their own with any banding stations catching 2 to 3 times as many birds. And black and white warbler is a species that really concentrates in South Florida, but we've got a lot of them here. And one thing we do have a lot of is veery. That's the earliest of the Catharis thrushes to migrate, and we catch 4 or 5 every morning. We hear them flying, so we're up to 62 for them. They're going to kind of wind down. We're starting to see Swainsons and gray-cheeked. No hermit thrush yet, still too early for them. But that's, I think, the number one Catharis thrush that we catch at Cape May. And red-eyed vireo, just a very abundant bird across eastern North America. We're starting to get more. They're just now, like, we kind of think 5 or 6 today, which is, so they're starting to increase. And then they'll probably finish moving through by like end of September. And ovenbird makes the top 10, but not nearly as many as Cape Florida. They're just kind of get 1 or 2 a day. And then we had this year, I think they're all through now because I haven't seen any all week, but the first 4 weeks we were banding, we would just see Baltimore Orioles just flying, just in flocks, just passing through the area. And then we get just kind of 5 in one net here, 5 in one net there. They kind of like to hit in groups, and some of our nets that are along the edge. Orioles really like edge habitat. So for me, being from Florida, that was a special treat to get my hands on a lot of Baltimore Orioles. We didn't have any adults, though. They're all young of the year. This is a young male. And then our bonus species so far, we had one day where we caught 2 hawks. We caught this broad-winged hawk. He was fun to look at. And then we caught another bird, which being from Florida was fun to see in the hand, a nice adult spring American goldfinch. They're really late breeders. We caught another one, a female who still had a big brood patch. It wasn't even a fading brood patch. This was like second week, the last week of August, or maybe first week of September. She had an active brood patch. They breed really late. And then we caught an American woodcock. Wait, what was that thing? That thing is a timber doodle. It's a bog sucker. It's a hokum poke. It's a Labrador twister. This is our favorite bird that we've caught so far. It's just so bizarre. Woodcocks. They winter in this area. They breed. I think they both breed and winter, and they definitely are a migrant through the Northeast. Unfortunately, they're involved in a lot of building collisions. But we actually caught one, and to see this thing in the hand was amazing. The tail looks like a hummingbird tail, a little short thing with so many feathers. It's got in the second picture from the left is really skinny outermost primary flight feathers is how they make a call. They dive and the wind whistles through the feathers and makes a really distinct part of their display. And the eyes, because it spends all its time probing, its eyes are set really far back on its head so they can kind of see, they can see in 360 degrees. Their eyes are so far, so they can keep an eye on whatever's going on when they're probing. So when you look at the back of their head, it's almost like a frog because the eyes are like sticking up from the skull. And then the face, the eyes so far back. So that it's just so weird. I love that bird. Also, they dance. Go Google woodcock dancing. The people set it to different music, and it's just hysterical. And another thing that we're seeing up in Cape May that I didn't see a whole lot of in Cape Florida, even though we started the same time, August 15th, there's a lot more species breeding. So it's really interesting to watch the local birds. Like on August 15th, we'd have some migrants, but we were actually catching a lot of local birds, including these really young catbirds. Like we'll catch young of the year in Florida, but this is juvenile. He hasn't even molted. When they're first born, they're fuzzy. When he's first fledgling, they're fuzzy. You can barely see the black cap. It's still got a gape. And then they really quickly molt into body feathers that you'll see. They'll have the black cap. They'll have the red underneath the tail. They'll be the catbirds that we're used to. And then the adults, when they're done breeding, they don't look very nice. They do a full body molt. This is a yellow rump warbler. And you can see the new feathers are coming in. The old feathers are being lost. And because it's a complete molt, they look really, really ratty. You guys, people in Florida, you might notice your cardinals and blue jays in August look really awful when they come to the feeder. Sometimes they have bald heads like a vulture. That's because it's that end of season molt. And so far, since August 14th, we banded 2,239 birds. Last year, they caught about 8,000. So we're about a quarter of the way through the season. We've had 66 species because there's a little bit more diversity. There's species that are northern that we don't get in South Florida. There's, chickadees and Carolina wrens and stuff. Our biggest day was actually today. We caught 147 birds this morning. I didn't have time to put them on the slides, but we had 65 or 60 something yellow throats. That was our bread and butter bird, but a lot of diversity along with them. We banded our first yellow-billed cuckoo. It was a juvenile yellow-billed cuckoo. It was so young, it still had a gray bill. And then we caught a black-billed cuckoo, which is supposed to have a gray bill. So it was really, really cool to see those at the same time. And what we're still to come is our big thing is we're far enough north to get slammed with yellow rump warblers. And last year, I think they out of 8,000 birds banded, I think something like 4,000 of them were myrtle warblers. So they don't start coming until October. And when they come, we're gonna have some really big days. And it's like brace ourselves. Some of the nets are just cut in tunnels through wax myrtle, which is our favorite food for wintering. And yeah, we're going to be slammed. But we also have to look forward to, we lose the warblers this far north, so it is kind of sad to see the warbler diversity that we had in August go. It's fun to see it at Cape Florida, as you guys, you know, you guys are starting to get that warbler diversity. We're like, bye. But well, we've got these short distance migrants, so I haven't seen a lot of, because I'm, you know, from Florida. So I'm kind of looking forward to these sparrows. We'll get, I think, Swamp is supposed to be the #1 sparrow we catch, but we should also catch white-throated. We should catch song. We've already caught a couple of fields and a chipping. We're hoping for something like a fox sparrow, but there could be like, yeah, 5 or 6 or 10. So it's kind of cool this far north to replace the warbler diversity with sparrow diversity. And then I'm also hoping we'll definitely catch ruby crown kinglets. I'm also hoping we catch a golden crown kinglet, which is a guy on the left. Is like the cutest bird ever in the history of the world. So yeah, I'm hoping we get some of those. Hoping we get some nuthatches. Hoping we get maybe some winter thrushes, some purple not thrushes, finches. Hoping for purple finches. Even hoping for an evening grosbeak. Even though it'll bite my fingers off. We're open till November 10th about.
Yeah, so at Cape Florida, we're kind of dealing on orders of magnitude fewer birds. By comparison, we've gotten, like I said, I pulled these numbers on Tuesday, so they're off by at least 100. But we've had 560 birds banded of 26 different species. Also, we opened August 15th. We did have to lose a day to Hurricane Idalia. As I said before, the bird safety and volunteer safety is a priority for us, and we weren't quite sure what the wind conditions would look like out there. We don't want birds in nets that are blowing around. Our biggest day so far, unless somebody today did not update me, was yesterday, where I got to band 81 birds of 13 different species, including our first Swainson's thrush for the season, which was quite early, but we'll see what that means. They normally come through in batches. Still to come for us also, as Michelle said, they've been dealing with gray catbirds since the beginning of the season. We will not start getting our gray catbirds until later. So we're ready for that. When they do come, they come in droves, and they are a lot of fun to extract out of the nets. So they're both a blessing and a curse when they show up. We get some nice big number days, but we spend a little extra time and heartache trying to get them out of those nets. We also are waiting on all of our thrushes. Like I said, they're going to come through in waves, hopefully soon, but the movement is still really slow at this point in the season. And we will get to see, you know, a good diversity of species to come through eventually. And as I mentioned before, we are still waiting on lots more black-throated blues. By the end of the season, that will be our #1 bird by a huge margin. So we will see a lot more of them in early October. Sometime between mid-September to mid-October is when we really start to see a peak in those numbers, and we'll get to see a lot of them at any given time. I'm sure all of you living in the area will get to see a lot of them in your backyards. So with that, I just invite you all to stay tuned. If you are not aware of our blog for Cape Florida, we do have our Cape Florida bandingstation.wordpress.com blog post. We're going to try to keep that up to date so you can see all the action that's going on behind the scenes. And just thank you all so much for being here with us tonight and caring about our birds migrating through South Florida and through Cape May. It's really such a privilege to share this with you.
Thank you so much, Steffanie and Michelle, for that excellent presentation. Super interesting. I'm going to give people, our viewers, a couple of minutes to put your questions in the chat so that we can ask Michelle and Steffanie those questions for you. And while I give you a minute to do that, I'm going to very quickly just talk about our annual and only fundraiser for the Cape Florida Banding Station. It's called Adopt-A-Net. Some of you may be interested, know about it or have donated in the past. Basically, money we raise through Adopt-A-Net helps fund the operations at the Cape Florida Banding Station, and particularly to replace those delicate mist nets that get torn and break down in the elements, and need to be replaced every so often. It's also a really fun and educational way to make a difference. If you donate for a half net for $75, a full net for $150 or above, what they do is they put your name, a little name tag on a net, a half net or a full net, and at the end of the season, you will get a personalized report from Michelle listing all of the birds, all the different species that ended up in that net and were banded that season. So I personally do it every year and I absolutely love it. This year we have something new. We have 2 VIP levels. We have the $500 level and the $2,000 level. And with each of those levels, you get a private tour of the station. And as it turns out, Michelle is also a very talented field sketch watercolor artist. And you can see one of her watercolors right there. And so with the $500 donation, you would get a print of one of her works. And with the $2,000 donation, you would get an original watercolor field sketch painting. So you can use the QR code right there. We'll also be sending out an email with a link. We'd really appreciate any donation. And thank you very much. So now we're going to move on to any questions that people have. Brian Raposa should be monitoring some of those questions. Brian, do you want to put your video on and read some of the questions out loud for Michelle and Steffanie?
Absolutely. There's just a few questions that have been submitted so far. The first question was submitted by Juan, and he wants to know, how long does fall migration last? And what about spring migration? How long does that last?
Fall, there's birds that start migrating, like really early migrants, like Louisiana water thrushes are moving in July. It basically, so there's, this is kind of songbird based, but you also have shorebirds that are migrating early, and then you also have raptors, which come a little bit later. But the songbirds, there's a few in August. We start in August because you catch different species you don't see later. But really about now, it's starting to build up. It's like a big curve where it starts slow, and then right about now, mid-September, it really builds up a lot of momentum, and the diversity goes up, and then all the way through mid-October, where in mid-October you get the most numbers, but you might have less diversity, because it'll be like all black-throated blues or cappers or something. And then it tapers off really quickly at the end of October, early November. The neotropical migrants have moved through, and it takes a long time in these days for the short distance birds to make their way to South Florida. So fall's pretty long. Spring is more concentrated. Spring doesn't really get going till there's a wave of Parulas early in like February, and then there's a whole lot of nothing in March, and then you might get in late March some birds starting, and in spring though peaks like mid-April through first week of May, sometimes the second week. Our last 2 or 3 springs have been pretty rear loaded with us catching half of our birds. We're open for 2 months. We catch half of our birds in the last 2 weeks of May.
All right, thanks,
so
Michelle.
You don't have that long to wait in between migrations.
Okay, the next question comes from Eileen, and she's thinking that for banding data to be useful, it's obvious that the bird has to be recaptured. But does it have to, is it useful if it's only recaptured once, or does it have to be recaptured many times for the data to be more useful? And how often do recaptures actually occur?
Yeah, recaptures, that's a really great question. Recaptures are not nearly as common, as Michelle said. I mean, there are literally millions of birds on the move any given night. We're banding a very small fraction of them, and the odds of recapturing an individual are relatively low. But that's a good sign in general that the populations are bigger than just the birds that we're encountering. But I do also want to point out that banding data can be helpful even if you don't ever recapture that individual. We have grad students who are working with us right now and using the data that we've captured at the station to understand trends in how habitat change are affecting the usage of Cape Florida. They are able to look at, especially in our case, because we've been running for 20 years, They can look at trends over time and populations, how different species are moving through at what time. So it can actually be useful, even if we never recapture that individual, just to know what is moving through. But I think every bander always worries about, what about all the ones that we never see again, or all the ones that we hear in the trees but never go in the nets. I think it's kind of our mythical white whale, if you will, are all the ones we didn't catch.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. Before I go to the next question, just a comment from Nicole Rita. She's reporting that today only 30 birds were banded at the Cape Florida banding station. So I guess a much slower day today than yesterday. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. All right, the next question. At some point in the presentation, it was mentioned that I guess during fall migration, the adult birds that are migrating south tend to go more inland, while the juvenile birds that are migrating south for the first time, they tend to stay closer to the coast. My assumption would be because they've never done that migration before, they're using the coast as a landmark to get where they're going. But Jerry is asking, I guess he notices that he sees a lot of adult birds in the fall on Cape Florida, and he's wondering, what are they doing there? Why aren't they more inland? What are they doing on the coast?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it'd be really cool if a PhD like took our data and looked at it more. But my theory is, what I think, just from what I've heard and read, is I think there's several things going on. One is the species we get in Miami are close to, I guess the reason birds would divide and the young would be at the coast and adults would be inland has to do with higher quality habitat. There's less competition because there's less birds, coastal migrant traps, because we were talking about earlier, weather and not wanting to cross the ocean at that time collects birds. They're inexperienced. The adults kind of know, stay inland. They've done this a couple times. You know, you don't have 7 other birds in your tree. There's less raptors, less predators. So since that's the norm on the most Atlantic coast, the reason I think that breaks down here is, first of all, you don't, like, a lot of birds are going down the Appalachian Mountains. There's a whole different set of birds that are following the mountains. And obviously, by the time we get to Florida, there's no mountains. There's not a whole lot. There's not extensive forest inland. There's just, you know, the Everglades and little hardwood hammocks that are, you know, from the point of view of forest songbird, a hammock in the Everglades isn't a whole lot better than a hammock on the coast. But also, a lot of the species that we see a lot of at Cape Florida most of the time are species that are going to the Caribbean, and Cape Florida is very similar to their wintering habitat. So the adults don't really have any reason to not want to stay inland. Also, we're at the bottom, you know, everybody's kind of piling up at the bottom, getting ready to fly over to the island. So that the whole adult, you know, they don't care. The adult birds really don't mind being at Cape Florida.
All right, thanks,
I don't know if
Michelle.
that answered your question.
Oh, hopefully it answered Jerry's question. Before I go on to the next question, another comment. This is from Sierra. She just wants to thank you, but thank you both for all the work you're doing at the banding station. So I hope everyone feels that way. I certainly do. All right, the next question from Jenny. She wants to know, how often do other wildlife, raccoons, get to the birds inside the nets?
That's a really good question. We try to avoid this as much as possible, especially at Cape Florida, because we are close to an urban center. We have not only our native wildlife, but also invasive species like feral cats and the black spiny-tailed iguanas that can actually come and remove birds from the nets if they're in there for too long. I think somebody else may have also asked a question about how long birds are in nets. This is why we run regular net checks, to avoid predation risk, to avoid birds being stressed out for extended periods of time. It does still happen. One of the things that we do at the station is we're very attentive to anytime we do happen to see a predator in the area, like raccoons, we'll keep those nets raised higher so that they're out of reach of those species. You know, you can imagine a raccoon kind of standing up on its hind legs and trying to reach up at the net. So if you can raise the net up above that level, you can try to curb some of those predation incidents. And we are really, really mindful of that throughout the season. When they do hit the nets, birds are actually surprisingly quiet for most species. So their goal is not to draw attention to themselves. But unfortunately, we do have so many raccoons, iguanas, and things like that in the park that it is, they happen to stumble upon them, whether or not the birds scream in the nets. They tend to stay relatively calm though.
All right, thank you. This is kind of a follow-up from Sadie. What happens if a bird gets injured once it's in the net? Has that ever happened?
Injuries, they're very, very rare. We do everything we can, best practices, to make injuries be like 0.5%. I mean, it's a very, very small number when you consider the amount of birds we handle. When birds are injured, there are some birds that we actually, because we have a lot of volunteers that have worked with rehab, like in Pelican Harbor, and we've actually been able to take birds to Pelican Harbor that we know that they have a good chance of rehabbing, and they've been released. You know, because usually they get something called wing strain, which they can recover from if just given enough time to just chill. So that's what we try to do with some of them. There's other birds that you just pretty much have to just release and just let nature take its course and just hope for the best. We have recaptured birds that were injured other places just out in the world with healed injuries that are pretty amazing. And you're like, you catch it, it's migrating, it's thriving. So, you know, we do what we can, but mostly our biggest number one thing is to take best practices to make sure that we don't have injured birds in the first place.
All right, sounds good. Anna, how much more time do we have?
Oh, we're at 7 o'clock. So if there's any more questions, can you wrap them up?
Sure. Jabran wants to know how someone could get involved in helping at the banding station, an internship as a volunteer, that kind of thing. So who could answer that question?
I can take it, I guess, if you'd like, Michelle. I think
Sure.
in general, we're really committed. We know that we're quite special in South Florida. There's not a really large ornithological research community. So we're pretty unique and privileged to be able to offer those opportunities. We do try to provide opportunities like that for people to come out and volunteer with us and get the training that they need. So if you are interested, I think I may have included the email address already, but you can email info@capefloridabanding.org, and our wonderful leaders this season, Nicole and Nassim, will get back to you with some more details of what the expectations are, because we do look for kind of a consistent commitment for at least, I think, 8 days throughout the season is the target that we're looking for. But reach out to them and they'll help you get oriented, and hopefully I'll see you out there.
Great. One more question and then we'll call it a night. Who's using the data that you're collecting? Like, for example, does Everglades National Park, do they have a use for banding data?
I used to work within Everglades National Park, banding and monitoring Cape Sable seaside sparrows. So they had a use for banding in that context. Our migratory bird data isn't really used by Everglades. But our data, it goes to the national, our bans are issued by the federal government. I submit the data to them so people can do a data search, and our data has been used for that. We've also had collaborators come and either request data that's already been collected or help us at the banding station work alongside us collecting specific data that they want for their research. So our data has been used in many publications, or some, and I'm hoping, because it's a long-term data set, a 22-year uninterrupted data set is a rare thing. So we're hoping to promote more, just make it more known that we exist, because that's when you can start dealing with like climate change questions, is when you have but I already have an email about somebody who wants information on thrushes that I need to talk to you guys about. So the more known we get, the more chance we have with collaborators, where our location is really interesting on a hemisphere wide level, because most of the banding stations are like in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. There's some on the Gulf, And we're pretty much in a really, I mean, Cape May now, Cape Florida is in a really unique location where, you know, it's a transition from the temperate to the tropical, and it's really, it's a good location for like hemisphere-wide studies of specific species.
All right, thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Stephanie. And that's it for the questions. So Anna, I'll send it back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie and Michelle, once again for this excellent presentation. And for all of you who are with us tonight, thank you for joining us. For more information, you can email Michelle at capefloridabanding@tropicalaudubon.org or visit tropicalaudubon.org to look for the recording and any more information that you need. Also, we have upcoming field trips that Brian Raposa will be leading. And again, thank you very much and have a good night. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Mhm.